Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this month's Core Advocates webinar. Tonight, we're going to be talking about assessing literacy with Achieve the Core's ELA mini-assessments. We're going to wait just a few minutes to get started. We like to give people a chance to get logged on and settled in. So we would encourage you to go ahead and download any handouts, and we're going to pop up a little poll for you to answer so that we can get a sense for our audience. And we'll be starting the webinar in 2 or 3 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing with us. It looks like for the majority of our audience tonight, this will be your very first Core Advocates webinar. Thank you so much for being with us, and we hope you find it a rich experience.
Well, once again, welcome everyone to tonight's monthly Core Advocates webinar. We're excited to be talking tonight about the ELA mini-assessments. My name is Joni Funderburg. I am the Manager of Professional Learning on the Field Impact team here at Student Achievement Partners, and I am joined by the rest of my team, Jenny, Janelle, and Sandra, as well as some wonderful, amazing guests that are going to share information about the mini-assessments with you tonight. Laura Hansen is here from SAP, as well as Jenny Aberle and Rob Woodworth. So before we get started, seeing as about half of you are first-timers tonight, you might not be familiar with Core Advocates. For those of you that are joining for your first time, we want you to know that Core Advocates is a national teacher network of over 13,000 educators who all believe in the importance of college and career-ready standards for all students. We work to support each other and our communities in ensuring that all students have access to these high-quality standards through classroom instruction, curricular resources, and assessments. If you'd like to learn more about the Core Advocate Network, you can contact me or my colleague Jenny directly. Our emails are here on the screen for you. You might also want to join the network by signing up on our website, Achieve the Core. There's a link there, and we encourage you to visit our website for more information and opportunities. We have many Core Advocates who are active on social media, and if you are one of them, we encourage you to tweet tonight about your learning, both during and after the webinar, using hashtag Core Advocates. We would also love for you to tag us on your tweets using our Twitter handles. Those are listed here. And we definitely encourage you to follow Student Achievement Partners on Twitter as well, and on Facebook, where you can find us at Achieve the Core. We do our best to make interactive opportunities for you during the webinar, so we'll be asking for you to engage with us tonight in a couple of different ways. You'll be able to access our handouts for tonight on your control panel. Feel free to download those at any time for your reference. You can also ask a question at any time or respond to the webinar questions using your questions tab. And you will engage with the polls that will pop up right on your screen. You just click on those if you were on right at the beginning for our how many webinars have you been on poll. You've already seen how to do that. After tonight's webinar, you'll receive a survey, and we greatly appreciate you taking the time to complete the survey as it helps us to make improvements each month. In a couple of days, you'll also receive a link to the recording of tonight's webinar, as well as all of the presentation materials and the PowerPoint slide deck. We encourage you to share those with your colleagues who could also benefit from the learning that happens on tonight's webinar. So with all the business complete, let's go ahead and get started on the content that you came for. During tonight's webinar, we hope that you will understand how to recognize high-quality assessments that are aligned to college and career-ready standards. We're going to give you a chance to consider SAP's collection of mini-assessments as a model for high-quality aligned assessments. And then you're going to hear about how a specific district in Kentucky has used these mini-assessments to impact classrooms and student achievement. So we're going to start by talking more carefully about what the characteristics are of high quality or next generation assessments. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our guests, Jenny and Rob, and let them start by introducing themselves.
Hi, everybody. I am Jenny Aberle. I'm the high school English language arts specialist for Jefferson County Public Schools in Louisville, Kentucky, and I'm really proud to be a Kentucky Core Advocate.
Hello, my name is Rob Woodworth. I am an English teacher at Doss High School in Louisville, Kentucky.
All right, we're going to start off with a poll. How familiar are you with next generation assessments? Those are assessments that have arisen since the advent of college and career-ready standards.
Okay, it looks like most of our audience have not utilized next generation assessments, but second runner-up, we do have 32% of participants who are familiar with the assessments, although they have never used them.
All right, good information to have as we move forward with this, to be aware of what our audience's background knowledge is. So we're going to start off talking about the shifts for English language arts and literacy. We've been talking about these literacy shifts with student achievement partners for some time now, but if you're not familiar with them, here's a quick review. Shift number one is regular practice with complex text and its academic language. Shift number two is reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from text, both literary and informational. And shift three is building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction text. So these shifts provide a frame that describes how the Common Core and other college and career readiness standards raise expectations across multiple areas of the educational experience, including instructional materials, classroom practice, and assessment. In Jefferson County Public Schools, our journey with this work really began 2 years ago when I attended sessions at the Student Achievement Partners core convening in Denver on how the Student Achievement Partners mini-assessments address the literacy shift. During this webinar this evening, we'll really focus in on how Shift 2 applies to assessment, that whole piece about being grounded in evidence from the text. Even though that's our focus, Shift 1, using complex text and building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction, Shift 3 are also applicable. So when we think about Shift 2, reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from the text, here are some main implications. Number 1, traditional assessments have all too often focused on superficial analysis of text or simple recall of information. So when we compose our assessment questions, we think about what truly matters in the text. We move beyond the details students can easily find by skimming and scanning, and instead we want them to think carefully, and we want to ask questions that lead to students developing deep understanding of text. Second, questions have asked students for responses based on the text, but we don't know if students get the right answers by reading the text or if they're able to guess or by some other kind of test-taking strategy. So when we write our test questions, we think about ensuring that the items ask students to use evidence to support their answers. We want to make sure they're going back into the text and they're getting the questions right because they've actually read it and understood it. And finally, traditional writing prompts have asked students to make things up out of their heads. Students weren't given a context from which to write and to provide evidence. The Common Core State Standards aligned prompts require writing to sources. Students are given sources, oftentimes that's some type of text, and they have to use them to make and support claims and inferences. So when we write the mini assessments, we often begin by thinking about the big understanding students should get out of the text. We then craft constructive response questions first in order to ensure that students have the opportunity to write about what they've read. Now, Rob is going to go through some of the specific examples of questions with us. Rob?
Great. So if you take a look here, we have an example of a couple of traditional questions I created based on the book Unwind by Neil Shusterman. If we read through those questions, we see things like, what is the tone developed in chapter 21? A, frightened, B, concerned, C, melancholy, D, adventurous. These are traditional questions we're sort of used to seeing. The first question is a basic question about tone with 4 one-word multiple choice answers. And the second question is similar, in which it asks a basic question about motivation and has multiple choice questions with 1 or few word answers. So now let's take a look at some examples of aligned questions I created for a classroom assessment from the same book, Unwind. The question types on the next 4 slides would be considered next generation assessment question types that are aligned to the Common Core standards and Shift 2. Questions grounded in evidence from the text. Now notice that these questions have 2 parts, part A and a part B. The purpose of having 2 parts is so that once students choose their answer for part A, in part B, they have to provide evidence to support their answer for part A. And then notice that this question also aligns to 2 standards, standard 4, which is vocabulary, and standard 1, which should always be in play, which is the text evidence standard. Part B is really how we address standard 1 in this question. So this question also shows a different type of question students will encounter in the SAP mini assessments and other next-gen assessments. Notice this question has 7 answer choices, and students are asked to pick 3 correct answers. This is different from traditional questions in that students have more opportunities to choose related answers that show a deeper understanding of the text. The close reading is an important part of CCR, and questions like these add a level of complexity in which students must read closely to answer the question correctly. Guessing the one correct answer is less likely with a question like this. And notice that, like the previous question, this question also aligns to 2 standards. And so the question type on this page is a little different and has students choose correct answers from a list and then find supporting details from the passage to justify or support their choice. Now, if this were taken on a computer, it would be a technology-enhanced item in which students could drag and drop. And now here is an example of an optional passage-based writing prompt modeled after high-quality assessment items in which students are writing to text. So a characteristic of next-generation writing assessments is a high-quality writing prompt that is textual or evidence-based. So we just looked at some questions that show how next-generation assessments are aligned to the shifts. We saw questions that require a part A and B, in which answer part B supports the answer choice for A. And we saw a question that shows evidence of close reading, in which students had to choose 3 answers. And also, we took a look at a writing prompt that was really focused on writing towards sources rather than being sort of decontextualized or not attached to anything.
Great. Thank you, Rob and Jenny. That was super helpful to help us better understand what the criteria are for high-quality assessments aligned to the shifts. So we have a question now for you, our audience. If you would please type into the question box your response to this. We're curious what obstacles you find teachers face in trying to use assessment items that are aligned to these college and career-ready standards and aligned to the shift. So let's just take a couple minutes and let you use the questions box to respond.
Thank you so much for answering the question, and Laura and I will continue to reply to some of them and share them out. We know you can't see what everybody writes, but we'll share a few out as you respond so you can see them. Many people are mentioning time, the time that it takes to give these types of assessments, but also grade them. So we might have some time later in the webinar tonight to ask our guests about how they deal with that obstacle. Many other people have mentioned the rigor and the difficulty that students have with these types of questions, and having students who aren't prepared to answer these types of questions. So we will try to address those as we go throughout the webinar this evening.
Yeah, thank you for those great responses and keep them coming. We're going to go ahead now and shift gears. Now that you have the basic understanding of what those criteria are for these type of assessments, we're going to talk about Student Achievement Partners mini assessments for ELA and how they serve as a model. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jenny.
Okay, thanks. So Student Achievement Partners has created mini assessments to help teachers better understand what high-quality assessments, whether they're formative, classroom, or summative, should look like. So I'm going to take the next few minutes and walk you through what some screenshots are so that you can see what those look like, and then later we'll talk about how we really used those. So what you're seeing right here is a screenshot of what I'll call the landing page for accessing these mini assessments. And you'll notice at the top of it, there's a link there that you can, when you get to PowerPoint, click on it, it'll take you right there. So currently there are over 50 mini assessments on achievethecore.org for most every grade level. If you look over to the left-hand side of the screen, you see where you can filter all of these assessments by grade. So you don't have to scroll through elementary school assessments, if what you're really looking for is something for 11th grade, you can filter those out by grade level. So they've done a really good job of making it easy for you to access and find what you're looking for. Grades 3 through 11 are represented, and each grade has at least one example of a literary assessment and one of an informational assessment, which is really helpful because sometimes finding high quality informational assessments is not easy for us. Further, at each grade level for 3 through 8 and the grade bands for 9, 10, and 11, 12, each literary and informational standard is represented by at least one item, and in most cases there are multiple items to represent each standard. Remember, when you get the recording of this webinar, you can go back to this slide and click on that link at the top, and it'll take you to that mini assessment page on Achieve the Core, so it's easy to access for you. So this screenshot shows an example of a literary assessment that has been developed for grade 9. It's from Departure by Sherwood Anderson, as you can see. But as with any mini assessment, this could be used for advanced students at a lower grade or less advanced students at a higher grade. On the last poll, you all mentioned that the rigor of the questions was something that was a struggle, and that's something you need to consider when you use these, whether or not you can use it down a grade or up a grade, depending on where your kids are and their needs. The next generation question types that Rob shared were actually modeled from an assessment like this. When he talked about the part A and the part B and the drag and drop or the fill in the blank, the boxes, those come from assessments that look like this.
And Jenny, I just want to chime in that this actual assessment on Departure is the handout for tonight's webinar. So if folks would like to open that up and follow along, you can look a little more closely at the screenshots Jenny's going to be talking about.
Great, thank you. So this next screenshot is what you see when you choose an assessment. If you've downloaded that one from Departure, at the very beginning, you'll see a page that looks like this. This is really for the teacher to know what is in that assessment. So at the top, you'll get some basic information regarding the assessment, such as the recommended grade level, the text and standards to which the questions are aligned. You can see that there. And then following this page are student directions for the assessment along with the text and the questions. I didn't screenshot those. I felt like that's pretty self-explanatory. But this page is really helpful for the teacher to see what standards does this particular assessment ask questions about. So then after that page, you've got the text and the student questions. And then following that, here's a screenshot of another page that's really information for the teacher. This provides the detailed quantitative analysis, such as the Lexile or the Flesch-Kincaid. They always try, Student Achievement Partners generally provides 2 different quantitative analysis if they can of the text. And then following that, you've got the qualitative analysis of the text. So notes are provided here to justify the placement of the text based on the structure, the conventions, the knowledge demands, and the levels of meaning. And you've got an explanation for each of those. And then on the far right-hand side of the chart, teachers can see specifically if the text falls in the high or low range of that grade band. And that helps teachers see and understand at the very bottom that overall placement, why it was placed in, for this particular text, grade 9. This really gives teachers the opportunity to think about what's important in a particular text and why it fits within the grade band that it's placed. And then finally, at the very end, the teachers get the correct answers, the standard alignment. Please note, standard 1 is always assessed in every question. That aligns to that shift 2, where students need to use evidence from the text. Usually there is more than one standard that you'll see that's aligned there. And then you also get rationales for answer options for all of these mini assessments. So you can see they're very robust. Student Achievement Partners has put a lot of work into creating a variety of mini assessments for a variety of grade levels, and you get more than just a text and questions. You get the rationale, you get the standards alignment, you get the answer justifications. There is a lot of information there for a teacher that helps you better understand the characteristics of a high quality assessment.
Great. Thank you, Jenny, for that fabulous overview of SAP's mini assessments. And now that our audience has had the opportunity to have a little bit of exposure to what those are all about and how they're structured, we would love to hear how you could use those mini assessments in your own setting to help improve alignment to high quality assessment. So once again, if you would pop into your question box and we'll kind of facilitate your responses and share them out, and Jenny and Laura will tell us what they're finding.
There's some great responses, great ideas here. One of the things that I think is really interesting is using these as a model to better understand what the standards look like and what they mean. So that was a great idea. Another is just a quick pulse check, as someone called it, to see how their students are just progressing towards mastery of a particular text or an excerpt from a novel study in the classroom. Jenny, do you see any of that you want to share?
I saw a couple people mention using them as professional development for teachers, just to get an understanding of the shifts and what they look like in items and responses. And also, I think you said PLCs for common assessments to sort of norm around what they look like. And then I saw people mention as models, if you want to write your own items for assessments for units that you teach in your classrooms, using these as a model for what does an aligned item or an aligned assessment look like. So all super great ideas, and Laura and I will continue, and Joni as well, to share out responses that we see coming in.
Yeah, you guys are flying in with some great ideas and great comments. We're going to work hard to keep up with you tonight. Okay, well, we are at an exciting part of the webinar now. We invited Jenny and Rob to be our guests on tonight's webinar because they just have such a great story of how they went from not knowing about the mini assessments to really using them and seeing impact in their schools and in their district. So I'm going to turn it over to Jenny to talk a little bit about their journey in using the mini assessments.
Thank you. So this is my favorite part to talk about when I think about the mini assessments and high quality assessments, because we have had a very interesting journey in our district. So part of my job, the responsibility, is helping support our students to help prepare them for our state assessment. So our journey began around 3 years ago. Our state has gone through a lot of different changes, and around that time, even though we had the Common Core standards, our state decided to utilize this off-of-the-shelf assessment that really would not be considered high quality. In fact, that assessment no longer exists, which is a little bit telling. So as a result of my frustration with this assessment and teachers' frustration with this assessment, I was on a search to find something better. So I attended the 2016 core convening in Denver. And during this time, I was really on a mission to learn more about high quality assessments. I was very frustrated at that time, and I just needed to learn more. So that was what I was there for. And I was so pleasantly surprised that there were multiple sessions on assessments and high quality assessments. And I know it's crazy, but I actually got excited about assessments for the first time in a long time, about high quality standards aligned assessments. I learned so much. And prior to this experience, I could say my main emotion was just frustration. So fortunately, after attending and borderline harassing some of the presenters trying to learn more, they at Student Achievement Partners were willing to partner with me to roll out and introduce these mini assessments and standards aligned questions to teachers in my district. So Laura and Katie from Student Achievement Partners came to our district to provide an intensive training to our PLC leads on high quality assessments and the standards. And then those PLC leads were to take that information back into their schools. So our district is pretty big. We have about 25 high schools. So building capacity within leaders in the schools is really important. So this was one way we tried to do that. So upon taking that information back into their schools, I took on the role of choosing already created mini assessments that were aligned to our curriculum maps and the standards in our curriculum maps to help teachers know which ones to choose that would match what they were teaching. I created bubble sheets for these to help save paper and to make grading easier for teachers, and just put them out there and highly encourage teachers to just use them, to try them. They were totally optional. We wanted to make this low risk for teachers. It was explained to them that this was a year to explore, to play with these types of assessment items and questions, because we really expected our state assessment would move towards these types of items. And we wanted our teachers and students to be ahead of that. Rob, who spoke earlier, was one of those teachers who was a part of that training with Katie and Laura, and he is one of the teachers who decided to jump in to work with those mini assessments and to even start to do his own work with that. So I'm going to turn this back over to Rob and let him come down and talk to you a little more about how this looked for a teacher in a school. Rob?
Yeah, like Jenny, I shared a lot of similar frustrations that assessments we were seeing from the state and the sort of traditional model was just not working for a lot of my kids that maybe are just bad test takers, gap group students, students with lower skill sets than others. We were having issues with assessment performance and having it be an accurate reflection of their learning. And I saw this as a great opportunity for change, moving to this sort of student achievement partner next gen model. And I decided alongside my PLC team to sort of try it for myself by piloting these mini assessments in my PLC as a sort of benchmark exam after going through and doing some in-class work on these standards and skills. My goal with it was to help maybe track progress, to get a feel for how my PLC team liked working with this model, and also, and most importantly for me, getting some real honest student feedback about how they felt it represented their understanding. Because I think if you can get students invested in their own understanding, then they're going to push to build it. I took that one step farther as well and began writing about my experiences with the Student Achievement Partners sort of format and my experiences for their aligned blog. and I believe there's some links that they'll share with you there so you can read a little further into my experiences. And I was also starting to look at other aspects of my teaching through this Student Achievement Partners lens, not just my assessment, but also how could I look to incorporate the shifts, whether it's, content-rich informational text while I'm talking about poetry, or whether it's making sure that evidence is a part of everything I do, not just things like assessment and writing. And it didn't just work for me. The great thing was that I also heard a lot of feedback from my fellow teachers that had really positive experience using the SAP Minis and formatting their own test questions to look like this. And you can see here, I've jotted a couple of comments down that the teachers on my team had for me about it.
Yeah, and I'm going to piggyback off of that, Rob. That last bullet that you had, that was really something I heard from a lot of teachers, that before you start using these new types of items with students, you got to let them know what's coming and get them used to that so that they know what to do with it. I've also heard a lot of teachers in our district over the past couple of years say a lot of positive things about these mini assessments. One thing that teachers say is they are hard for students. That's because they are standard aligned assessments and questions, and the kinds of things that we've seen in the past haven't always been. But what teachers really like about them is that students are slowing down to actually read the passages so that they can answer the questions. Students say, I can't guess on this, like I have to read the passage, I have to go back in. And so teachers also, when I ask them how they compared to previous types of questions and assessments we've used, they said hands down that they believe that these assessments and these types of standards aligned next gen questions are doing a much better job at showing what students actually know. And because they're well aligned to the grade level standards, they just really give teachers a good sense of where they need to go next with students and with what students have a really good handle on. So I'm hearing a lot of positive feedback from a lot of teachers across our district.
And my main goal the first year that I went through and did this was I really wanted some student feedback. I wanted to hear their thoughts, get their investment. And I asked them 3 questions. The first was, what elements of this assessment format were helpful? And what you can see here are some straight out of the student mouth thoughts that they gave to me about what they were liking and what was helpful about what they were seeing in the SAP style assessment. So I asked them what was helpful. And the second question I asked them was sort of what was challenging about the format. It's definitely different than what they've seen. And I've got some responses straight from students here about what they thought was challenging. All right. Questions having more than one answer, not being able to choose your own qualities for things like the chart, referring back to the text, making inferences, which is something my students I know always struggle with. And I definitely saw a lot of feedback about they would make really great, attempts to answer chart questions that weren't exactly the answers we were looking for. The last question I asked was, I wanted to know, did this type of assessment better represent their knowledge? Did it show their understanding? And as you can see, we have 1 yes, we have another yes, and we have yes. I had a couple of kids say no, but I think the overwhelming response was yes. They even understood you have to have these evidence skills. You have to have key detail knowledge, that there are more options for them. It's not A, B, C, D, wash, rinse, repeat over and over.
So as a district, what did we learn after that first year, last year, of using the Student Achievement Partner Mini Assessments? We learned that teachers who've been taking the risk and using those assessments are seeing better student results. They're seeing an assessment that's more aligned to what they're teaching and how they teach. While the assessments are more difficult, students are liking them more than the traditional assessments. That's something that really surprised me. Now, not every student, but the majority of them like the challenge. They like the kinds of questions that they're seeing. And the biggest takeaway, there are a lot of big ones, but for me, one of the biggest ones is that these assessments align with the quality instruction that's already taking place in classrooms. We've been talking in our district for a long time about the 3 shifts and really trying to push teachers into those shifts instructionally, and they have done that. The big disconnect has been that we have not had an assessment that aligned with those shifts, nor did it really align with that instruction. So there was a big disconnect there for teachers, and teachers felt like they had to teach to this test, this low quality test. Now they feel like there's just this natural connection between instruction and assessment. They look very similar, so there's more of a connection between those 2 pieces now, and that's really important for teachers. So that's where we were last year. This year, we've started the next step of that journey, which I am even more excited about. In the last question that was asked, I was looking at some of the responses there, and a couple of you had mentioned that, oh, we could use this with our assessment writing team. We could do PD sessions using these with teachers. We could use them as models. And I say, yes, that's exactly what we did. So we really used last year to get teachers familiar with these types of assessment items and questions. That's where we gave them to teachers and said, play with them, use them, get familiar with them. And then we found out at the beginning of, at the end of last year, that we were moving over to a new assessment system, and we highly anticipated that our new assessments would look like next-gen assessments. So at the beginning of last summer, like at the very end of May when school was out, we assembled a team of about 16 teachers who spent last year working with those Student Achievement Partner mini assessments, and we began to create our own high-quality aligned district common benchmark assessments. So these teams that came together, we modeled our assessments directly after those from Student Achievement Partners. We chose text that were on grade level. We use those analyses tools that are provided to really dig in and see, are these texts at the right level? And so we created assessments, and teachers began to implement them this year as our district common benchmark assessments. Most teachers found them to be more challenging and difficult, and there were some mixed reviews from students. But the reason they found them more challenging and difficult is because they're on grade level and they're assessing grade level standards. They're high quality. Overall, I am so proud of the team who created these assessments, and I really believe that they are a true measure of our students' learning, and also, again, connect to our teachers and how they teach. So our state assessment did change this year, and we don't use an off-the-shelf assessment. Our state decided to choose teachers from our state to create a field test this year. Very, very few teachers from across the state were chosen to create these field tests, and I was so excited that one of the teachers from our team was chosen to be a part of our state team, which made me feel really proud that we had somebody who was highly trained and familiar with high-quality assessments and assessment items, providing feedback into what our state assessment would look like.
Wow, I have heard your story a couple of times now, but it's super inspiring. So thank you both so much. We're going to move into Q&A time for Rob and Jenny, and several of you have already started to type in your questions for them in the question box. But before we go there, I did see a couple of comments about elementary. I know Jenny and Rob's focus has been with secondary level, so I wanted to just give Laura a chance to talk a little bit about connecting the mini assessments with elementary students.
Sure, happy to address that. So we actually, when we started out, you know, you guys probably aren't going to like me much after I tell you this, but we actually created the two-part item, and it was at a charge by David Coleman back in the day to actually have assessments that aligned to college and career ready expectations, so that when kids got up in college or had to defend their point of view in a career, they were used to doing that. So we put pen to paper, came up with this item type, and we piloted it at the elementary level. And that was purposely because, you know, I'm a former elementary teacher, so I was a little worried myself that elementary kids weren't going to be able to do this. But in fact, the results there have been quite astounding. They have embarrassingly proven me wrong. And if you are part of either consortium, so either Smarter or PARC, you know that as low as grade 3, those two-part items are on the assessment. As you increase in the grade levels, you have the multi-select, which is where you have multiple pieces of evidence in an item or in a Part B. And so, you know, I had egg on my face, but kids can do this. But the key, as someone in the question box pointed out, is this has to start before kids see this on a summative. So if you're a K2 teacher, K1 is really focusing on building that vocabulary and increasing that fluency so that kids can master these complex texts. But they should still be seeing some simple multiple choice items at some point in time, so they don't freak out when they get these kind of more complex items. And then by grade 3, those kids should be ready because the K2 teachers have really pushed. And if they haven't pushed the fluency, pushed the vocabulary, then I'd be talking to the K2 team and say, hey, you know, I can't list this by 3rd grade by myself. I need you guys to really help. Just an occasional exposure to a certain item type. And, you know, this doesn't always have to be in writing. When I created this item type, it was because I wanted to model what you guys are doing in the classroom. Every single teacher always asks, how do you know? And that is using evidence. So if people say kids can't use evidence, that is not true at all. You do it every single day in the classroom. The only difference here is this is in writing, and if kids are well versed in using evidence in the classroom, eventually, as with anything, you continue to practice and they'll get it.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. That's super helpful. I think this is a good question for Rob that came into the question box. So maybe, Rob, you could answer it. Somebody is wondering if any of your teachers brought the results from the mini assessments to their PLCs.
Yeah, we definitely, we use a program called Mastery Connect at my school to track data and progress through standards. So what we would do is input our scores into there by standard, and that way we could get a look at how kids were progressing. We gave many of these minis throughout the year, and we could start to track improvements, see which questions or standards they were still struggling with. So it was definitely a whole PLC group endeavor where they were taking the same minis and looking at skills gaps and growth and areas for improvement within the PLC, and then planning instruction based on what we saw.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. Jenny, I think I'm going to have you answer a time question, especially because that came up in our first section when people were asked about obstacles that teachers face. So when do you have time to do this, and what organizational structures do you use to do the work?
So I found that time is really something important to consider. This is hard work. This is thoughtful work. And asking teachers to come in and spend 2 or 3 hours after they've taught all day is probably not the best time to start this work, at least in terms of creating questions. I think you have to scaffold this for teachers like you do for students. So our first year, it was really about getting familiar with what's already out there and what's already created. So doing something like that in the summer especially as we're going into summer, is a great time for teachers to start getting their heads wrapped around these types of questions and assessments. And that gives them the summer to ponder them, to think about them, and to maybe even start thinking about how they could create their own questions modeled after them. So I think giving teachers time to play with them, to get familiar with them is really important. And then once they're familiar with them, I think, again, in terms of creating assessments, I think the summer's a great time to do that because the teacher hasn't been teaching all day and they're not exhausted, and they can really put the kind of time and thought into that work. I think we spent 3 days right after school was out last year creating our assessments. And I was real strategic about that because I didn't want teachers, I wanted to get them while they were still fresh off of the end of the year, not maybe in August when they were not quite ready to go back yet. And that ended up being a good time for us. But if you've got release days for teachers, that's a good time, but trying not to always hit them at the end of the day after they've taught all day with some kind of a PD. But I've found, at least in my experience, like summer has been a really good time because they have the time, they're not exhausted, and then they can also play around with it over the summer and get ready for the next school year.
If I could chime in a second, I definitely agree. If your school has dedicated time for staff PLCs, it's a great use of that time to get used to the formatting. And really, it's a lot of front loading, getting familiar with it, getting kids familiar with it, but it takes a lot less time once you actually are used to the structures and the phrasings and the just general formatting of the questions becomes a lot easier to manage.
Great, thank you so much. I think we have time for one last question, and maybe Rob or Laura, any of you actually could answer it. Many people were asking about how to use these mini assessments with English language learners, and so maybe you could speak to anything that you have experienced or knowledge you have around how to use them with students who are acquiring English.
Yeah, Rob, you want to go, or you want me to go?
Yeah, I've got a couple of just minor suggestions. Definitely, like I'm sorry, I forget who mentioned it earlier, but you can scale these up and down depending. So if you have an English language learner that's scoring maybe a 2 on that 5-point scale, and they're in 10th grade, you can give them a 5th or 6th grade assessment, and it's the same skill set with maybe a text that would be easier for them to grasp. I think that you obviously have to sort of, you've got to, hang on the word now, you have to modify the assessments as well to kind of maybe give them dictionary word banks. I mean, like you would modify anything. I think if you were to just practice with the formatting with them, then it just becomes a little more routine, the same way they might already be used to a traditional four response multiple choice.
Yeah, and I might add, we just recently updated the mini assessment with some L scaffolding at the end that would give you some ideas on how to scaffold. But one thing to always keep in mind with assessment, especially if you're using these in some way to prepare the students for the summative, is that you really don't want to make modifications or accommodations, depending on your audience, that they won't be allowed to use on the summative. Like if you're just really wanting to see how they're going to perform on a summative, be mindful that accommodations and modifications should be similar. But if you're just using them in the classroom for student growth and because you want them to think about the use of evidence and you're using those rationales, then you should absolutely feel free to scaffold however you deem appropriate for those kids.
And I'll say that one thing that some of our teachers have done, because there are so many assessments that we can access and use, is they'll sometimes use them instructionally. They won't use it simply as an assessment for a kid, but they'll use it through instruction to help kids see how to read a difficult text and how to navigate through those questions.
All right. Well, we are running out of time, but thank you, everyone, for your great questions, and thank you, team, for the great responses. A lot of information covered tonight, and a lot learned. So just to wrap us up, one more reminder: if you're not already part of the Core Advocate Network, we would love to have you join, so you get all the information about all our tools and resources and upcoming webinars. You can do that on achievethecore.org/CA-sign up. So please take a moment to do that if you haven't already. We know a lot of you will take some information that you learned tonight back to your setting, and we would love to hear about how it goes. So please take a moment, too, to fill out our instructional advocacy action form. You can find that at achievethecore.org/educators-taking-action. We'd love to hear about what's going on with you, whether it's about this or another strategy or tool that you've tried, and we might even tap you to be a guest on a future webinar to tell us about your learning. We hope that you'll be able to join us again next month. If you enjoyed learning about the ELA mini assessments this month, please join us again for our June Core Advocates webinar, and we'll be talking about the math mini assessments. So on behalf of all of my colleagues tonight, thank you so much for joining, and we wish everyone a great night.